Hey, I'm Pastor Colin from Aletheia Bible Fellowship. Today we're going to be discussing Abraham as an example of godly agency and what sacrifice looks like in that. And he's got a bunch of different examples in his adventures and journeys and lessons that he learns as he pursues God's promise appropriately. So if that sounds like something that is helpful, go ahead and watch the sermon. If it turns out to really be helpful, go ahead and share it with your family and friends and anybody who might find that interesting and beneficial. So have a good day, and I pray that it finds you well.
Alrighty, so kind of like we talked about last week, Abraham, he was called out of a pagan city, by grace. An agency comes from grace, as we sort of contemplated last time. Our all-powerful sovereign God, he passes down his sovereignty, right? He chose to design us in his image, that he would be graceful enough to pass down some of his sovereignty to us creatures that he made in his perfect image, marred as we are. He still sees fit to allow us some free will in this. So, do we look at our circumstances, as we talked about last week? Do we look at our circumstances as undeserved blessings in this measure of grace, or undeserved burdens in light of it? You know, when our kids are whining, even those kids that aren't ours, do we remember the blessing and opportunity that they are? When we're slaving away, especially if we're working alone on some sucky menial project, do we remember the God-given blessings of work, of the investment that is, and the blessing that God gives us on that work? All responsibilities are given to us by grace. There's also a divide, though, in how us and the world understands agency moving forward on the flip side of that. That's all kind of about where agency comes from, right? In grace, called out of where we are and given these things. But moving forward from that, there's also a divide on how the world views things and how believers are to view things. Agency is conquering by the world's understanding, right? Some of the people with the greatest agency have used that agency to direct and control and guide and oftentimes oppress, large portions of the world. But for us, it's different. God's wisdom is unintuitive, even backwards, right? To shame the rebels and bring glory and honor to the only wise God. Agency under God is defined by the death blow that he dealt to the enemy through his son, Jesus Christ. Agency under God is sacrifice. That's where it starts, moving forward from the grace aspect of things. The world understands this intuitively to some extent, right? We all know that it takes sacrifice to make it, quote unquote, in the world, to rise to CEO, to be a successful parent, to be a proven and respected leader in whatever sort of community or environment you're in. All of those things we have sort of a innate understanding of to some extent. We understand it takes grit. You got to dig deep, to have real agency to take hold of that. But for the world, this sacrifice, it's all for you to accomplish your personal gain, to exert your personal dominance over things, to build yours. And we know that because when it comes down to it, to save your family, for example, to the world it's justifiable to do some awful things. Stealing, lying, many would say even murder to save them, right? For believers, God comes before all things, and his moral law and command comes before all things in our agency. For believers, sacrifice is all for God first, for others second, and for you last of all. This is the model that Christ demonstrates for us. He was scourged and crucified and died to save us. And lastly, Jesus was glorified and brought up to the right hand of the Father, right? And what happened when that occurred? Matthew 28:18 says, Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth after his resurrection. After his sacrifice, he was put in a position of complete agency. That's what we see God's order is, and the order that we are to follow after too. Everything in the order of Christ. Ephesians 1:19 says, I also pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe him. This is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. Now he is far above any ruler or authority or power or leader or anything else, not only in this world, but also in the world to come. God has put all things under the authority of Christ and has made him head over all things for the benefit of the church. So again, we see in this agency, it's always for the benefit of others. It's always after sacrifice, and it's always instituted from the very start by grace and by God's assignment and calling a person to that sacrifice. And for those who by faith pick up their cross and follow after him, these things are true too. Those who sacrifice for Christ's sake will ultimately be given even more agency in God's kingdom. And that scale is huge. We can't fathom the scale of that. You know, the apostles, they're told that they will be sitting on thrones helping to judge the world. You know, and they were called, each of them very much individually, to their own paths, following in the footsteps of Christ, making that ultimate sacrifice. But again, this line of faith, it comes back to a nice focal point in the life of Abram. And that's what we're contemplating this month. Like we said before, Abram, he was called out of security and family and luxury, etc., from a position of grace. Like God called him out of that sinful city, out of that environment that really was dead in terms of where its legacy was going. But today I want to emphasize the sacrifice of that calling out and how that played out in the rest of his life. Abraham, again, he lived in or near the big fancy city, and he was wealthy. And that city, it provided all sorts of business and customers, you know, for the economy of it and all the things that Abram was involved in. And he was decently wealthy, right? The city provided all those resources and customers, the economy for his business, all the fertile lands around it that was able to support such a population. You know, whenever he needed something or wanted something, like all of those things were available to him. It wasn't a wilderness by any means. It's kind of the equivalent to New York City today, right? Imports and exports and a trade hub. They even had a whole system of canals to import or to move goods around this city of 65,000 or more people, which is massive for that time in history. Likely the biggest city in the world, like we talked about. It was a port city, right? Right on the Persian Gulf and the Euphrates River. They had, we know like the site of that city and what that all looked like. And they had a full-on deal of city planning with like places where individual people were settled in, and like the economic districts and all sorts of things. Like it was extremely prosperous and well thought out. These are the things that Abram was called out of as a person that was interested in business, as a person that had stuff to sell, had stuff to buy. That was his livelihood, and that's what he was doing. Yet he was willing to leave all that and head into no man's land, where there were not those resources. There were not those resources. And in fact, what did he find when he got to the place where he was being called to? He was called to Canaan, and then he moved down to the region of the Negev. He basically ran into a famine. He went from this place that was really fertile, really prosperous, had all these resources, and he ran into a famine. And so what did he do? He bailed, and he went off to Egypt, which seems to be a pattern, you know, in his family, a temptation, because Egypt, though it was not a place of God, it was a place of resources and prosperity. There's the Nile River, one of the biggest rivers might be the biggest river in the entire world now that I think about it. It's enormous, and that sucker don't dry up, even in a famine. So he bailed and went off to Egypt, where the famine had less effect. God doesn't comment on whether this was appropriate or not, interestingly enough. There are other points made in that story. But, however, we know that Abram was in the promised land already. That's where he was called to. And he left it to find security. But that security, it was not founded in God yet. Right? He was still maturing. He was still trying to figure this out. He was very much on this journey. We know that Abram is still figuring out what it means to live by God's grace because he doesn't trust God fully in this. When he goes to Egypt, what does he say without going over all these passages of Scripture, because there's like chapters and chapters of this, but his wife, right? Yeah. His wife, Sarai, she is also his sister, and so he is a little bit deceitful, and he tells the people that she is not his wife, but his sister, so that they would give him things instead of murder him and take his wife, right? And so he's insecure and dishonest about that. He's deceitful to protect himself, and he tells the Egyptians all these things. And upon the shame of that resolution to that awkward scenario there, he basically gets the boot from Pharaoh, and he has to return to the Negev, which is that region that was not very well off. It's like an arid, kind of deserty type place. And I don't even think the famine was over, because he didn't stay there. It wasn't like, oh, things are cool now. He got booted out before he was really ready to come back. He went to this place, but then he had to move on back to the area of Canaan where God first brought him. And he had set up an idol there. Or not an idol, a altar. But yeah, he wore out his welcome in Egypt, and they sent him packing. But he didn't belong there anyway. God's providence was not with him in how he decided to go to there, how he decided to handle that, and that just general way that he decided to handle that situation. So, Abram moved on past that Negev region and up into a better area that's between Bethel and Ai. This whole area, that is still the promised land, and he likely should have come there instead of Egypt to begin with, you know? He had options, but he decided to instead go to another region of the promised land that was doing better. He decided to go to Egypt in response to that insecurity, in response to that famine. He didn't count the fullness of the sacrifice that God had called him to, right? He didn't believe God in all the details of that, is what we can gather from this story. And it is interesting to note that Abram, after these mistakes that he made, he returned to the place where he had set up an altar to God. If we return to Genesis 12, verse 6 through 8, it looks like. It says, Abram traveled through the land. This was like right after God's initial call to him to come out of Ur and to move into the promised land, and that he would be made a multitude of nations, or a great nation, and all of those promises. This is right after that. So Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the right, east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And so altogether, let's just rehash kind of what all happened there. Abram is approached by God. He's promised to be made into a great nation. He's taken to a new land, promised to be given that land, or to his descendants. And then he moves to a desert-like region in the south of that land. Things get rough with a famine, and he runs away to Egypt. He makes some bad choices out of insecurity. And then he decides to return to the original spot where God promised that land, and Abram erected an altar to God to remember and worship him for what he had done, what he had promised, and what Abram believed in faith at that time. It was a sacrifice for Abram to move out of his family's place of comfort, and that had costs, which seemed to have caught Abram off guard a bit. And following God turned out to be a true sacrifice for him, and, as Jasmine might say, a snacrifice as well, seeing as they were short on food. But he appears to have matured and learned some lessons. He decided at that point that he was going to return to God. He was going to return to his last point of being on the right path, where he had set up an altar in worship and thanks and remembrance of God. When we follow God on a sacrificial path, we should ask the question, do we get scared by a little famine? And better yet, do we run away from God? Do we run away from the bounds that God has given us, the place of blessing? And, do we stick to the places that we know are healthy instead? Right? Because Abram, he returned to the bounds which God gave, to the altar that he had set up. So we should ask the question, where have we set up an altar to God? Where have we set up an altar to God? And even if we come to church every Sunday and, 4 or 5 days a week in between that, I will say that does not mean that you've set up an altar to God here. Because we can come here, we can do the motions, but when you're in a place where you need to contemplate your choices and return to God, where do you go for that? Where do you go for that? Maybe it's a mobile command center, Maybe it's your scripture, and you will dive into that sucker and find a closet wherever you are and return to God, return to the altar, return to the path. Maybe it's a place that is, your place of contemplation and meditation. Maybe it's something that you set up specifically. Maybe you have nowhere. But we should think about this. One reason, it seems effective to do that, and that is how we do things, right? That's why God sets up so many festivals and holidays and things like that, is so that we can remember God on a regular basis and return to him in the mess of life. But we should learn lessons when we need to and return to God when it's appropriate there. And one reason I think that we think Abram learned some lessons in this narrative is because of what immediately follows this situation. Immediately following this, we have Abraham and Lot. And Lot is his nephew. He came along for the ride out of Ur. Abram kind of took him under his wing, and eventually, like Lot, amassed his own wealth and possessions and livestock and all these things, and was doing pretty well. But Abram treats his relationship with him in a way that is very secure, very secure, very sacrificial, if you might say. Genesis 13, 1-13, says this. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev. This is taken up right where we kind of left off. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together. for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So there's a lot going on, a lot of competition for the land, sheep and things, they eat a lot of stuff. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked around, and he saw that the whole plain of Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Yeah, it's the security of Abram here is admirable, right? He sees all this stuff, and he says, "Hey, Lot, go ahead and take a look around and choose what land looks best to you." And so Lot goes and he surveys the whole place. It is a decent place. It's not like he just stood there and was like, yeah. I mean, he thought about it for a while. He basically was like, what is going to be the best land here? And Abram was under no illusions about this, but he was good with it, you know? He wanted to sacrificially protect that relationship, to be able to give up what was just to call it a material component is kind of an understatement, because, I mean, there's a lot going on there. He has a lot at stake. Land is money. Land is livelihood, you know, when you have livestock. But he was completely secure in that, which is a total, 180 from being insecure about God's providence on the other side of things. And especially when you take into account, Abram is entitled to, this land. God gave it to him. He didn't give it to Lot. He gave it to Abram and his descendants, which is not Lot. And so he was being very generous, very sacrificial in how he went about that. And even further, Lot owes Abram, if anything, some sort of a relational, maybe even financial debt and respect for taking him in as a son or a close relative, a brother, and leading him to owning a great flock and having wealth and all this stuff. And yet Abram gives him the choice of the best land. The agency of Abram is of faith and righteousness and generosity here, not of utilitarian pragmatism and being, conservative and stingy and things like that. So it seems that Abram learned his lesson from going to Egypt in lack of faith, that he's living in security. He's not worried about his own provision and trying to have the best stuff for his life. He could have easily, broke into a casual negotiation and be like, well, if you take this land, then maybe I'll have some of this, and we'll do this and that, so it's fair and equitable between us. He was like, look, you choose it, I'm going to be all right. And that's cool. That's very mature. But that is not the pattern of the world, right? People scheme and manipulate to get the best for them. And we couch it in all sorts of different language, and we, have our own plans, like behind the scenes and contingencies and all this stuff. But to just summarily say, you choose what you think is best, I'll take the rest, that is something that reeks is a bad connotation. That is, it's indicative of godly security. Trusting God to take care of us in our pursuits. For the world, even the stupidest things sometimes are argued out of instinctual insecurity. People will fight over $5 of gas money and things. I've heard some really, really stupid fights over utilitarian practical things and stupid little negotiations and stuff where being like, yeah, no, I'll give you a ride. Like, what's 10 miles of gas money between brothers? But a lot of the world doesn't operate like that. Not trusting God to provide for them in doing the right thing relationally, to live at peace with one another, as many places in the New Testament says. But it is also interesting, right, that God provided for Abram in this way, because later, what happened to that land that Lot had chosen? At the end of that passage, it says that that was the place where Sodom and Gomorrah were, and there was evil in the land. So it is interesting that even when Abram submitted that choice and allowed God to provide for him, he ended up with the land that was not destroyed later, that was not firebombed and made into an unproductive land. That's the land that Lot chose, even though it looked good on the surface. Abram trusted God to know best in his pursuits. How many choices have you made in your best wisdom? Little control as far as being able to foresee how something is going to turn out. So in our agency, how freely are we to trust God to do right in the moment instead of trying to control the future in some way that is probably going to prove ridiculous? And that gets harder and harder as the decisions get bigger and bigger, and the bill on those decisions gets bigger and bigger. But the principle is the same. Don't be anxious for buyer's remorse. Follow God's parameters, do right in the moment, be sacrificial in the control that you're given in your agency. Be generous. Do all things prayerfully. Abram was no longer insecure about God's provision, and we see that here. That brings us to the ultimate example of Abram's sacrificial attitude under the promise of God's provision. Genesis chapter 22. We read this. Sometime later, which this is chapter 22 now. We were just in chapter 12 and 13. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. And then he chopped wood for a fire, for a burnt offering, and he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. Stay here with the donkey, Abraham told the servants. The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the wood and the fire, the boy said, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham answered. They both walked on together. We don't believe this to be a lie. We believe this to be faith in understanding who God is. Not knowing the details, but understanding who God is and how he provides for us. And these lessons that Abram had learned from repetitive experience of God being faithful to him and his promises. And so, moving on, when they arrived at that place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am. Exclamation mark this time. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not even your son, your only son." And then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. To this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, is how that proverb goes. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. He says, "This is what the Lord says. Because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number, like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies, and through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me." As God reiterates his promise. In this we see, honestly, kind of a ridiculous amount of amazing attributes that are good examples for us. But Abraham is extremely faithful throughout this whole thing. Twice Abraham responds, "Here I am," to God, just as his reflex response to God calling to him. Just that. Even in this, where do we stand? Do we have that "here I am" attitude, standing at the ready? It kind of calls to a military perspective, almost, standing at attention. Willing to do whatever, trusting that God will provide, and that whatever it is, and worthwhile and faithful task. Where do we stand on that attitude? He is faithful in carrying out that extreme, intense command to sacrifice a son. And he does it in not capturing his son, right? But bringing his son along. Abraham is the uncontested patriarch of this family, but his son is a willing participant. We know from the Hebrew and from the circumstance that Isaac is not a baby at this point. Like, he's not like he doesn't get swaddled and tied up on the pile of wood or whatever. I mean, Abraham piles the wood on his back and walks for a couple days. He's a strong young man, and probably he could have beaten his father, Abraham lived a long time, but he was still over 100. Like, he was no spring chicken. And in a life or death situation, fight or flight response, it's hard to tie somebody up. And we don't get any indication of that whatsoever. But the partnership in this, the sacrifice on both sides, a father willing to sacrifice their son, and the son being willing and trusting to see through what that looks like and to know that things are going to be good because God is at the head of it, because a godly father is right below that. Do we have such elements in our partnerships as we pursue the calling of God, the path of God, the sacrificial life of God? Isaac didn't fight back. Instead, he worked together for God, carried the wood on his back. He allowed himself to be bound without resisting, having faith with his father that God would provide up to the moment of truth. There's a lot of elements to this. You can go into so many different things, but it's an awful story. It's undeniable. I wish my mom was here because she has a really hard time with this story. It's undeniable. And God doesn't disagree. God doesn't disagree that this is an awful story. Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, I believe, and some others, is utterly detestable to God. And why is that? Because children are sacrificed to him. They pass through the fire, as their romantic language indicates. Jeremiah 32:35 says, "They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin." God calls it that several times, detestable. And that God specifically, that idol specifically. And so why does God command Abram to do this? We see one reason really plainly in the text. In verse 1 of that passage, it says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith." Valid reason. God was testing Abram's faith. He was to be the patriarch of a nation that would bless all nations through the descendant of Abram. But the story proceeds. And in two different spots, talks about this, but God says, "Now that I know," or the angel of God says, "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld me, your son, your only son." This shows God tested Abraham's faith, tested his priorities, tested his basically everything. But there's more to it. Abraham had faith that God would provide somehow, and God did. God did provide the necessary sacrifice. But it's not as short as that, right? God is a more powerful, more wonderful storyteller than this. There are often undercurrents in God's narrative. That was the immediate meaning for Abraham. But God was teaching Abraham about his own character, about being willing to offer a son, about being willing, the significance of offering a son, and then the willingness and grace and mercy of God to offer another sacrifice instead. Like in the parables of Christ, God sucks his audience into the story before making a point of it. We feel Abram's impossible expectation to slaughter his son like an animal, and we're bewildered at Isaac's willing obedience to his father, even to the point of carrying the wood and allowing himself to be bound and prepared for sacrifice, and them working together up until the very moment of truth, serving God sacrificially. We're drawn into the story so we can feel God's sacrifice, to understand the injustice, to appreciate the grace and providence of God as God sacrificed his only son. As Jesus Christ went willingly silent as a sheep before the shearers, bound to be sacrificed, carrying the wood on his back, and the Father having to offer up a son that he knew was good and innocent. We're drawn so we can understand the injustice, appreciate the grace and providence of God in this sacrificial narrative. Yes, these events were to test Abram's faith as the patriarch in God's plan, but it's also meant to make us reflect on Jesus Christ, God's only son who is offered up sacrificially to us. And God says to Abraham, "You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son." And he reiterates that twice because that is significant. It's meant for us to build here today on Abraham's faith and trust God completely. who's the same God, as much as people don't want to say it, who's the same God in the Old Testament and New. Trust that God will also provide for us when we live sacrificially and withhold nothing from him. Trusting that God will reward our faithfulness. Trusting that God will bless others through our willingness to sacrifice and serve. So it's always the question of, do we believe these things in truth and action? When we operate in our sphere of agency, do we think about how our sacrifice points to Christ? You know? You can serve somebody all day, you can work in the soup kitchen, you can help your friends out moving their stuff. And there will be elements, that like they know you're a believer. Maybe you're working for an organization that holds up the banner of Christ. But how are you intentfully pointing to Christ in these moments, in these ways that we serve, in the ways that we sacrifice for people? What sort of conversations pair with that? Is that awkward? I don't know. Every circumstance is different. But trying is part of the sacrifice and figuring that out. Yeah. Does your sacrifice point to Christ, to God's deliverance? Sacrifice to a believer, it's not for a specific or selfish gain. It does have practical effects of it. Sacrifices oftentimes come back to us in positive ways, but most of all, it's a demonstration of our love for God and our prioritization of him and his commands, our love for one another. It's a demonstration of who really rules our lives. When Christians sacrifice for each other, we show the watching world that Jesus was really from the Father. That the Father did give up his only Son, who was innocent. And the Son did willingly bring his own sacrificial altar up the mountain and submit himself to it. In our agency, does our trust run this deep to that level of basic survival? Trusting our children and sources of food and livelihood to God? Or does it waver even when luxuries are at stake? I'd like to, just contemplating security in the realm of agency that we're given, I want to kind of wrap things up from the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 17, 5 through 7. This is what the Lord says. Cursed are those who put their trust in mere humans, who rely on human strength and turn their hearts away from the Lord. That's the grace part of it, calling Abram out of a prosperous place. Cursed are those who put their trust in mere humans and rely on human strength, turn their hearts away from the Lord. They're like stunted shrubs in the desert, with no hope for the future. They will live in the barren wilderness, in an uninhabited, salty land. But blessed are those who trust in the Lord and have made the Lord their hope and confidence. They are like trees planted along a riverbank with roots that reach deep into the water. Such trees are not bothered by the heat or worried by long months of drought. Their leaves stay green and they never stop producing fruit. Like Abraham, we can move to the most fertile valley of the Nile River, for example, and still be stunted shrubs in the desert when we don't pursue God in faith and willing sacrifice. But if we put our trust in the Lord, our agency will yield fruit even among the most barren land. And it does take a measure of faith to understand that and to cultivate that. You know? How many times has a person had a hardened exterior and to the naive eye, I guess, been a hopeless person? Yet, the truth of Christ can penetrate any of those things and reach water that only the Holy Spirit is aware even exists there. So be encouraged and stay faithful and within God's parameters when you're tested. Point all things to Christ in that. Forget what it was. Last week I talked about a song too. Yes. In My Chains Are Gone, the Amazing Grace song, one of the verses in there says, "The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He is my shield and portion be as long as life endures." I just like that concise and poetic version of that. That's pretty much what Abraham experienced when he wanted to go, when he was in the famine, you know? That verse that says, God's word my hope secures, and he promises good to me. God is my shield and portion, you know? Meaning God is my protection, so I don't have to lie to protect myself. And he is my providence, my portion. In those things, that's what we find in God. And so, as we go forward, take example from Abraham's lessons and eventually when he figured those things out and really started living a developed and mature, faithful life. Let's think about those things as we contemplate our own spheres of agency. So, for our questions, what does a famine look like for you? What does a famine look like for you? Where do you run to when a famine hits? Maybe it's, you know, your cell phone or your favorite TV show or whatever. But contemplate what things in your life are really within the parameters that God sets as good places to look for safety and security and providence. Those things that God has promised to you, that he's directed you toward. Because, I mean, to be honest right now, like, we have a dichotomy going on, right? Because we have this new land of promise that we're, like, developing and going to. But personally, like, a lot of us are kind of getting our butts kicked. And it's a personal famine right now. Like I was contemplating the other day, I'm like, man, I really need to, like, spend a couple minutes with my kids and family. Like, maybe I can take a day off in the middle of the week and, like, go to the wildlife safari or something. And I was like, this is not the time for that, though. It's like God will provide in this time, and afterwards, maybe that opportunity will present himself. But it's like, I was tempted in that moment, and from a righteous, like, standpoint of, I need to have family maintenance and things, you know? I need to go do this. But then it's moving outside of the parameters that I am convinced God has in terms of appropriate action and trusting for his providence and looking to the appropriate places for that. So it's like, where are you guys at in those things? What does a famine look like for you, and where do you run to when a famine hits? Somewhere appropriate, or maybe not so much? Okay, question 2. You can't do everything, so how can you have that here I am attitude of faith that Abram had? How can you have that here I am attitude of faith standing at attention? And number 3, how can your teamwork of sacrifice more closely resemble that of Jesus and the Father, or Abraham and Isaac? How can your teamwork of sacrifice more closely resemble that of Jesus and his father, or Isaac and his father? Okay, let's go discuss.